just to begin, could you sort of tell us a little bit about your work and uh, what you focus on as a journalist, and maybe how long you've been doing it, and where some of your work has been published?
Sure. So I started working as a journalist in 2002 with High Country News. And I worked there for about 4 years, I think. And after that, started doing freelance work. So I freelanced for local, regional, and some national outlets for maybe 10 years on and off. And also started working in public radio. I worked for KUNM, the NPR affiliate here in Albuquerque, and New Mexico Political Report, which is an online outlet, New Mexico in Depth, another online outlet. And for the past couple of years, I've been working for New Mexico PBS. I produce a monthly show focused on environmental issues around the state, and also produce segments for our weekly show, New Mexico in Focus. And the past year have been working on an investigative series with Frontline, in cooperation with Frontline, on the military's contamination of groundwater in New Mexico. So I focus almost exclusively on environment issues, and sometimes stray into social justice type issues involving tribes or the border or things like that. And yeah, that's it.
Okay, so what would you say, in the course of the 15 years or so that you've been reporting on environmental issues in New Mexico, what would you say are the biggest challenges that the state faces when we're thinking about climate change?
Yeah, so there's all kinds of issues, the same as around the Southwest, like a longer fire season, bigger fires, more severe fires, and all the expenses and dangers and long-term impacts that comes with. And then there's public health issues, increased dust storms that cause respiratory problems, more extreme heat, which affects, how people can live their daily lives, what kinds of homes they have. In southern New Mexico, we have a lot of people who live in cinder block homes with swamp coolers. And that's, as that part of the state starts seeing more and more extreme heat, that's not safe or healthy. But I think the biggest issue really is water. In the arid Southwest, warming means drying. So even when we have a pretty decent snowpack or an El Nino year and there's precipitation coming down, it still ends up being drier around the state. There's more evaporation, more evapotranspiration from crops and forests. And so really New Mexico's biggest issue moving forward, I think, will really be dealing with its water challenges.
I see. So I want to get to the water challenges because you wrote quite a bit about them and drought and stuff like that in your book, At the Precipice. But I also wanted to talk briefly about, like for me, I've kind of had this interesting experience this year where I knew that climate change was a problem, and it was something that was going to be affecting, the land around me and and human beings as well as other species. But I feel like it sort of felt remote for a while for me personally. Like it was something that if we don't start doing something now, bad things are going to happen in the future. But I'm sitting here, today in Colorado, and we've had the three biggest wildfires in Colorado history all in 1 year. And prior to that, the biggest wildfire was back in 2002. So we smashed through that record 3 times in 1 year. And, it feels like things are really, our decisions are coming to roost very quickly. And I'm wondering if you've had a similar experience in your reporting.
Yeah. So for me, I think especially the last few years, the last maybe 5 years, I've really been immersed in climate reporting. and really focused on looking into some of the fires that we've had here in New Mexico, like Las Conchas in 2011 and Whitewater Baldy in 2012, and the drying Rio Grande, which has become like this annual pilgrimage for me to go down and um, see this river that every year that it happens, I kind of stand in that dry riverbed and think, what the hell? This is the state's largest river and it's consistently drying. Like, how is this not an emergency that people are addressing? How am I the one standing here pointing out that this is a problem? And this year has been really interesting. This has been a really interesting year to publish a book on climate change. I used to joke years ago, especially when I worked for KUNM, the radio station here in New Mexico, I would do these stories on the river drying or the river about to dry, things like that. And inevitably, you know, we kind of joked, it seemed like as soon as the story aired or was about to air, we'd get like this big rainstorm. And so I kind of imagined like, oh gosh, I'm going to publish this book on climate change. You know, that kind of like worry that you always have when something publishes, like, what if there's a typo? What if there's a mistake? What if I did something wrong? And, you know, I thought, oh, this book could potentially seem so irrelevant, right? Who cares about climate change? And then this year, I just feel like we are just seeing the impacts everywhere, from these huge hurricanes in the Gulf Coast, where months later, we still have people displaced from their homes. I grew up in Connecticut, and so I kind of pay attention to weather and climate issues there as well. You know, I look at the drought map for Connecticut, and you know, this year they were in a serious drought. The Rio Grande dried this year from, you know, it's dried at the end of May and is still dry now in October. And then Albuquerque, prior to the snowstorm, the Albuquerque stretch of the Rio Grande was potentially going to dry and was at its lowest level since the 1970s. These fires in Colorado and California. I mean, I feel like we really are at this point in time where we are seeing daily the impacts of climate change here in the United States, to say nothing of the rest of the world. And I just, yeah, I mean, this should be a bellwether year for people to be like, wow, we've known about this for decades and we did nothing. And here's, you know, kind of what it means to ignore things for decades and decades.
Right, right. Yeah, it's interesting. And lingering just a little longer on wildfires, um, you know, it's often discussed that these fires evolve, or these forests evolved with wildfires,
Mm-hmm.
and you know, you kind of hear it as this political talking point that the reason that these forest fires are so intense is because of you know, like 100 years of mismanagement. And my thoughts on that is that is definitely part of the problem, but it's not the whole picture. I'm wondering if, you know, what do you think is the whole picture? Like, what is causing the intensification of these wildfires?
Yeah, so just as an example, like here in New Mexico, there's the Gila National Forest down in the southwestern part of the state. And, you know, they're just like other forests around the West, there was about a century of fire suppression there. So, you know, you didn't want the timber to burn, you didn't want private lands nearby to be burning. So fires were put out as quickly as best as they could be. And so the forests were overgrown. You have too many trees in the forest, too much undergrowth, you know, just packed in there, that dog hair thicket that we talk about. And so you have these very unhealthy forests that are too dense. And then you have warmer and drier conditions where trees are dying, so you have more stuff to burn. You have trees that are unhealthy and so more susceptible to things like bark beetles and ips moth and things like that that contribute to dying trees, where you have, stands and stands of dead and dying trees and lots of fuel to burn. So when a fire does happen, either human caused or lightning, there's so much fuel in there. But it really is, it's a combination of these factors where it was, certainly that fire suppression activity for so long changed the forests. They weren't sort of the natural forests that had evolved with fire, but then we have drier conditions, hotter conditions, and more fuel for them to be burning. So it really is a combination of factors involved. And here in New Mexico, we see, and I'm wondering what the studies will show in Colorado over the next few years as these areas recover from these big fires you had this year. But what we see here is there's new vegetation moving in. Those conifers aren't coming back. The fires were so hot that the seed source is destroyed, but also it's warmer and drier than when those forests, were grown up and nurtured. And so we see vast changes in the vegetation within these areas now.
Yeah, I think I've been reading a little bit about the same thing happening here in Colorado. And there was a term that was used in your book actually, that sort of described, because there's this notion that ecosystems are always in a state of flux and they're always changing a little bit. But you used a term in the book. You said transitional ecologies, and I think it speaks to the fact that yes, ecosystems do always change, and it's part of the give and take of life. But now this is something more fundamental. I wonder, could you talk a little bit about transitional ecologies and kind of what that means in terms of, wildfire and forests and maybe the landscapes around us?
Yeah, so an example of that is in the Jemez Mountains here in New Mexico. The Jemez, since the mid to late 90s, had been seeing like a lot of wildfire activity. And the forests in the Jemez were certainly subject to that same fire suppression and the same overgrowth. So you had these really dense conifer forests. And since the Dome Fire in 1996, we started seeing more and more fires. And then 2011, just that summer just erupted with Las Conchas fire, which was a super hot, super quick moving fire. Although that was, Las Conchas was like held up as like the fire that so many people were like, holy crap, that thing burned so hot and moved so fast. And so the fire that you guys just had right now, the East Troublesome fire, that one moved even faster. Anyway, sorry. So with the transitions, what happened was that that fire burned so hot, so severely in certain places that afterwards there was about 33,000 acres of this high severity fire that afterwards the ponderosas by and large were just completely eradicated from this roughly 30,000 acre area. And going back up there after the fire, you see there are areas that have been taken over by locusts. They were kind of the first ones to move in. So these locust thickets, and then some areas taken over by aspens. And then there's this huge area that is basically a grassland. It's like grasses and shrubs. And sitting on the east side of the Jemez Mountains overlooking the Rio Grande Valley, that totally changes that watershed. Just changes everything about that area. You have, it's a habitat now for Rocky Mountain bighorn sheep, which it was not habitat for them in the past. You see changes in the bird species, wildlife species. Just it's a remarkable change. Like having been up in the Jemez and experienced it as a thick conifer forest, to now see it as just an entirely different landscape is just it's consistently unbelievable. We're going to see more and more of that across the West.
Hmm. So it seems like these changing climatic conditions are causing prolonged droughts and hotter droughts that are, on the one hand, um, giving rise to these wildfires that are burning through trees, forests that have been where the fires have been suppressed for the last 100 years. Um, but drought also kind of really influences the watershed, and um, I know that, it's another thing that you really went into quite a bit of depth with, in terms of like the Rio Grande, which, as you mentioned, is the biggest river in New Mexico. Um, so, given these changing climatic conditions, what is the prognosis from the Rio, or for the Rio Grande, that you get when you talk to climate scientists?
Yeah, I mean, we just see the Rio Grande doesn't get quite the attention that the Colorado River does. It's fewer states, fewer stakeholders, fewer people, fewer large resources focused on studying it. But we can kind of extrapolate some of the work done on the Colorado River Basin and look at the Rio Grande and anticipate a 20 to 30% reduction in the Rio Grande's flows in the coming decades, which for a river that already dries, that's a pretty scary future. And one of the things that I find frustrating in covering, maybe it's all issues, but the Rio Grande in particular is, everybody, not the climate scientists, like the climate scientists are clear and, terrifying in their forecasts. But when you talk to water managers, everybody has their constituency. State wants to make sure that people feel reassured that New Mexico has an economic future. We want to reassure people that we can fulfill our obligations to Texas. The irrigation districts want to reassure their farmers. Water utilities want to reassure their customers and decision makers. And I feel like there's this sense, at least here in New Mexico, that we just keep hoping things will get better. Oh, there'll be an El Nino. Oh, you know, there'll be a better snowpack next year. And I feel like people are not realistic. And, I feel bad because I kind of feel like I can be the doomsayer journalist, but I don't have a constituency. I don't have to try to make anybody feel good or feel happy. And I find it really frustrating that here in New Mexico, people are not being realistic about the state's water future and the future of a river like the Rio Grande. And, kind of everything, we have, for example, we had a year this year from November to February where we had like pretty decent snowpack. It was a pretty good snowpack year, and yet we had devastating conditions on the Rio Grande by May through now October. And so wishing for next year's snowpack to improve when all of your reservoirs are low and 20 out of 21 river basins are below average in the state, that sort of hopefulness doesn't serve anybody anymore.
Right. Yeah. Well, I know that we've got that you have another call coming up really soon, but I just wanted to ask one final question. Um, in your reporting, have you come across any organizations or people that have given you reason to hope? Like, there's there's this dire convergence of events, but have you come across anybody who's doing any work that might, paint somewhat of a brighter future for us in New
Yeah.
Mexico?
So I definitely I am so grateful for sort of the science community, in particular, David Gutzler at the University of New Mexico, and Shailene Chavarria, who is a student of his who works for USGS now. There's so many people doing good work. Like, we know exactly what's happening and why, and we know it's going to happen. So it's amazing to have that roadmap and such a clear picture of the future. So there's so much good work being done in the scientific community. A lot of the hope that I feel comes from young activists and younger people in the scientific community, who aren't operating under this sort of mid 20th century kind of baby boomer notion that life's always going to get better. Just, keep your job, save for retirement. You'll buy that second home or be able to go on vacation every year, and your life's just going to keep getting better and better. I think younger people have a much different outlook on life, that that things aren't just going to get better without you actively engaged in your community and working really hard to make things better, and that it's not just about your own success or your own family's success, but that we need to be thinking in terms of communities, and that includes a global community. So I feel like the young people give me a great deal of hope, and I oftentimes feel like they're just waiting for us to get out of the way so that they can vote, they can make decisions, they can be actively in charge of dealing with these crises that older generations have just utterly failed. And I'm sorry, I don't mean to be such a curmudgeonly grouch about it. Maybe I should have eaten breakfast. But yeah, I definitely feel grateful to younger activists and younger people who are looking at these problems more clear-eyed, I think.
Very good. Well, yeah, so the hope for the future lies in the younger generations and their increasing involvement in activism and so forth. Um, well, I think that that's a really good note to end on. So thank you so much for taking the time to meet with me. Sorry for all the internet issues.
Not a
It happens.
problem. Not a problem at all. It's actually worked out great the second time, because one of my cats started throwing up behind me, and I was like, oh my God, what? Why? So good luck with your classes. Good luck with, I hope that the fires ease up. But yeah.
All righty. Well, thank you so much. Have a good day.
All right, you too.
Bye.
Bye. Yeah, for New
Kind of
Mexico. Yeah, for New Mexico, I think the biggest, and you'll see my pets will keep walking into the office behind me. So for New
making
Mexico,
cam.
I really, yeah, the really, as the region continues warming and warming at a even quicker rate than the global average, the really big issue that I see is continued water challenges in the arid Southwest. Warming means drying. So even when we have decent years of precipitation, a decent snowpack, or an El Nino year, we still see less water in the system, because when it's warmer, forests need more water, soils dry out faster, the demands for water are greater, and there's more evaporation from streams and rivers and reservoirs. So I think for New Mexico, the really big challenge is water security and a sustainable water future as the region warms. Oh no, I lost you. But I'll keep talking because it's recording. We also have problems with our wildfire season. Oh my God, cats. We also have challenges with our fire season and fires in our forests.